Most people answer this question without thinking. What style do you practice? It sounds harmless, normal, safe. But in rooms like this, that question does something deeper. It quietly decides where you belong. And everyone in the room was waiting for him to belong somewhere. Several people leaned in slightly, not dramatically, just enough to listen more closely. Their eyes stayed on him, focused, expecting closure, because this moment had rules, unspoken rules. Someone asks, you answer. The room understands you, and everything continues normally. This was how social structure stayed stable. Style was not just technique here. Style was identity. It told people who you were. It told them what shaped you. It told them what system controlled your movement. It told them how to mentally place you. And placement mattered, because once people place you, they relax. Their brains stop working hard. They don't need to observe you directly anymore. They simply observe your category. Some people already believed they knew his answer. Wing Chun, because of his past. Kung Fu, because it was the easiest label. Jeet Kune Do, because they had heard the name before. Each person carried a quiet assumption, not spoken, but present. They weren't waiting to discover. They were waiting to confirm. Their bodies reflected this certainty. Still shoulders, relaxed posture, slow breathing. No tension, because nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. This was routine, predictable, safe. The air in the room felt steady, not heavy, not light, just attentive. Someone near the front shifted their weight slightly. Another person folded their arms loosely, not out of discomfort, just patience. Because patience always ended with an answer. That was the invisible agreement everyone trusted. Questions created openings. Answers closed them. Structure remained intact. Reality remained organized. But something small began to change. He didn't answer. Not immediately. Not instinctively. He didn't rush to protect the structure. He didn't rush to satisfy expectation. He simply remained still, calm, present, unaffected. At first, no one noticed, because pauses were normal. Pauses meant thinking. Pauses meant care. But this pause continued. 1 second, then another, then another. Not dramatic, not obvious, but noticeable. Something invisible had stopped moving. The structure that normally completed itself didn't complete. The question remained open, unfinished, and without realizing it yet, everyone in the room had begun waiting for something that was no longer guaranteed to arrive. The pause that didn't follow the rules. He didn't rush. He didn't shift his body. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't smile to soften the moment. He simply stayed where he was, calm, balanced, present. His face didn't show resistance, but it didn't show compliance either. It showed nothing extra, just awareness. At first, the silence felt completely normal. People expected pauses. Pauses meant thinking. Pauses meant care. Pauses meant respect for the question. No one felt uncomfortable yet. They assumed the answer was forming. They assumed words were coming. This was part of the rhythm. But then the pause continued. Not dramatically. Not in a way that demanded attention. Just quietly extending itself. 1 second longer than expected. Then another. And another. No one moved suddenly. But small changes began to appear. Someone blinked more slowly. Another person shifted their stance slightly. A hand that had been resting calmly adjusted its position. Not because something was wrong, but because something was unfinished. The human mind expects completion. When a question appears, the brain prepares for closure. It prepares to receive information. It prepares to restore balance. But balance had not been restored yet. The answer hadn't come. And without the answer, the moment stayed open, unresolved. People remained patient, but their patience was no longer passive. It became active. They were now aware of the silence. Not uncomfortable, just aware. His breathing stayed steady. His posture stayed relaxed. He wasn't frozen. He wasn't tense. He wasn't avoiding the question. He was simply not rushing to satisfy it. That was unusual, because most people felt pressure to respond quickly. Most people rushed to remove silence. Silence created exposure. Silence created vulnerability. Silence made people feel seen without protection, and people instinctively filled silence to regain control. But he didn't. He allowed the silence to exist, naturally, without resistance, without urgency. This changed something subtle in the room. The silence was no longer empty. It became noticeable, not heavy, not hostile, just present. It began to shape the attention of everyone there. Their focus deepened, their observation sharpened, because now they were no longer just waiting for words. They were watching him, watching his stillness, watching his calm, watching his lack of reaction. They began to notice things they normally wouldn't notice. The steadiness of his breathing, the lack of tension in his shoulders, the absence of nervous habits, no tapping fingers, no restless movement, no signs of social pressure affecting him. This absence itself became information, because normally people showed signals when they were being observed. They adjusted themselves. They performed small behaviors to maintain social comfort. But he didn't perform. He didn't adjust himself to meet the room's expectation. He remained internally stable, externally neutral. This created something unfamiliar, because people were used to influencing each other through expectation. Questions created pressure. Pressure created response. Response restored structure. But here, the structure remained open, unresolved. Someone near the back slightly straightened their posture. Another person's head tilted just a little. They weren't reacting emotionally. They were reacting cognitively. Their minds were trying to understand what was happening, not logically, but socially, because something invisible had shifted. The normal exchange had paused, and the longer it paused, the more noticeable his calm became. He wasn't trying to control the room. He wasn't trying to resist it. He was simply unaffected by it. That was the difference. He didn't speed up to match their expectation. He didn't slow down to create drama. He simply existed at his own pace, unaffected, stable, complete. And without realizing it fully, the people in the room began adjusting to his pace instead. Their breathing slowed, their movements quieted, their attention narrowed. Because when someone refuses to follow social urgency, urgency loses its influence. Now, the silence wasn't just a gap. It became a presence, not something missing, but something intentional, something real. And in that silence, something important was happening. He was not preparing an answer. He was deciding whether the question itself needed one. The response that removed the category. When he finally spoke, it didn't feel sudden. It didn't break the silence. It simply continued from it. His voice was calm, not loud, not soft, just clear enough to be heard. There was no tension in it, no need to prove anything, no need to defend anything. He didn't rush his words. He let them move at the same pace as his stillness. He didn't say the name of a style. He didn't say Wing Chun. He didn't say Kung Fu. He didn't say Jeet Kune Do. He gave them nothing they could immediately grab onto. Instead, he said something simple. He explained that he didn't like to limit himself to a fixed system. Not because systems were wrong, not because traditions had no value, but because once you stay inside something fixed, you stop seeing beyond it. His words were easy to understand. There was no complexity in his language. No attempt to sound philosophical, no effort to sound impressive, just honesty. He explained that styles were created by people, and anything created by people had boundaries, boundaries that helped at first, but could eventually restrict growth. He wasn't rejecting styles. He was rejecting being trapped inside one. He described movement as something natural, something that didn't belong to any single name, something that existed before labels, and something that continued beyond them. He spoke as if movement was alive, not owned, not controlled, not fixed in permanent form. The room stayed quiet. No one interrupted, no one disagreed, but no one relaxed either, because this wasn't the answer they expected. They expected something solid, something familiar, something that would close the question cleanly. Instead, the question remained open in a different way. He had responded, but he hadn't given them the category they were waiting for. Their minds had nothing stable to place him inside. This created a small gap in their understanding, not confusion, but absence. The absence of structure. Normally, when someone names their style, people instantly understand their position. They mentally compare. They mentally evaluate. They mentally organize. But now, they couldn't do that. There was nothing to organize, nothing to compare, nothing to measure. He had quietly stepped outside the system they used to define people, not aggressively, not forcefully, just naturally. He wasn't trying to appear different. He simply was different. He wasn't asking them to follow him. He wasn't asking them to agree. He was simply expressing his truth without adjusting it for comfort. His body remained relaxed. His face remained neutral. There was no pride in it, no ego, no need for validation. He didn't look around to see their reaction. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't perform confidence. He simply existed inside his answer, complete, stable, unaffected. This made his words feel heavier than they sounded. Not emotionally heavy, but structurally heavy, because they removed something the room depended on, the ability to define him quickly. Without definition, prediction becomes harder. Without prediction, control becomes weaker. And without control, attention becomes deeper. People leaned on categories to simplify reality. Categories reduced effort. Categories reduced uncertainty. But he had removed the category. And now, they had to see him directly, without shortcuts, without assumptions, without mental protection. Someone in the room slowly inhaled and exhaled. Another person shifted their hands slightly. These were small movements, but they reflected something deeper. Their minds were adjusting, trying to understand him without labels, trying to observe without structure, trying to accept something fluid. He hadn't challenged them. He hadn't corrected them. He hadn't disagreed with them. He had simply refused to become something fixed for their comfort. And that refusal changed the balance of the interaction, because now he wasn't inside their system. He was outside it, not separate, not distant, but not contained. And once something cannot be contained, it cannot be easily predicted. And once it cannot be predicted, it commands a different kind of attention. The moment people lost their reference point, no one spoke immediately after he finished, not because they didn't hear him, but because there was nothing familiar to respond to. Normally, conversations moved in clear directions. Someone says something, others agree, or disagree, or ask another question. But this moment didn't follow that pattern. It stayed open, unresolved. People were still looking at him, but now their expressions had changed slightly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Someone who had been leaning forward slowly leaned back, not out of disinterest, but out of adjustment. Another person who had been holding a faint smile no longer held it. Their face returned to neutral, not negative, just thoughtful, because the structure they expected had not appeared. They were ready to receive a label. They were ready to hear something they already understood, something they could place inside their mental framework. But that framework had nothing to hold now. He hadn't given them a fixed point, and without a fixed point, their minds had nothing to stabilize around. This created a subtle feeling, not discomfort, but suspension, like standing on ground that was still stable, but no longer predictable. Someone crossed their arms slowly, not defensively, just unconsciously. a natural reaction when certainty disappears. Another person adjusted their posture and straightened their back. Their eyes stayed on him. More focused now, because when people cannot categorize something, they observe it more carefully. Observation replaces assumption. Attention replaces prediction. Before, they were waiting to confirm what they already believed. Now, they were seeing him without confirmation, without mental shortcuts, without simplification. This required more awareness, more presence, more honesty, because categories create distance. Categories allow people to think they understand without truly observing. But without a category, observation becomes direct, real, unfiltered. He hadn't increased his authority. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't claimed superiority. But something about his position had become different, not because he forced it, but because he didn't participate in the usual system of definition. He didn't offer himself to be simplified, and that changed how people experienced him. Because people rely on labels to create psychological safety. Labels make things familiar. Familiar things feel manageable. Manageable things feel less threatening. But he had removed familiarity. Not aggressively, not intentionally to disturb anyone, but naturally, by refusing to reduce himself into something fixed. Someone in the room blinked slowly. Another person glanced briefly at someone beside them, then looked back at him, not to communicate, but to confirm that others felt the same shift. Even though nothing dramatic had happened, even though no confrontation had occurred, even though his tone remained calm and respectful, something invisible had changed, because without a label, hierarchy becomes unclear. Without hierarchy, comparison becomes difficult. Without comparison, judgment becomes slower. And when judgment slows down, attention increases. People were now fully present, not because he demanded it, but because he left them no shortcut. They couldn't rely on their previous understanding. They couldn't rely on familiar structures. They had to experience him directly, as he was, not as a category, not as a role, not as a title, just as a person who existed without needing their definition. This created a quiet shift in psychological balance. Before, the room held the structure, the room held the expectations, the room held the system, and he was expected to fit into it. Now, he remained unchanged, and the room had to adjust instead, not consciously, not intentionally, but naturally, because when someone refuses to shrink themselves into familiar shapes, others are forced to expand their perception. No one argued with him. No one challenged him. No one tried to correct him, because there was nothing to attack. He hadn't rejected them. He hadn't opposed them. He had simply remained outside their system, and without realizing it fully, they had begun to see him differently. Not because he claimed anything, but because he refused to be claimed by their expectations. The silent shift in control. He didn't say anything else after that. He didn't try to explain further. He didn't try to make them understand more deeply. He didn't try to fill the silence he had created. He simply stopped speaking, and that was enough. Because the moment no longer needed more words. The room stayed quiet. But now, the silence felt different than before. Before, the silence was waiting for his answer. Now, the silence was absorbing it. People were no longer waiting. They were processing. Their minds were adjusting to something they didn't expect. Not emotionally, but structurally, because something important had just happened. He had been asked to define himself, and he didn't. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. And that choice quietly changed the balance of the room. Before the question, the room held control. The room created the expectation. The room created the pressure. The room created the structure he was supposed to follow. And normally, people followed it without realizing. Normally, people answered quickly. They gave labels. They gave definitions. They allowed themselves to be placed somewhere predictable, because predictability made social interaction easier. It made people easier to understand. easier to compare, easier to evaluate. But he didn't allow that. He didn't resist aggressively. He didn't refuse in a confrontational way. He simply didn't participate in the process of reducing himself. And that changed something deeper than the conversation itself. Because now they couldn't simplify him. They couldn't compress him into a familiar idea. They couldn't mentally store him in the same way they stored others. This forced them into a different position, a position of observation instead of assumption. And observation requires presence. Presence requires attention. Attention creates weight, not physical weight, psychological weight. He hadn't raised his status by claiming authority. He hadn't demanded respect. He hadn't asked to be seen differently. But by refusing to define himself within their system, he had removed their ability to define him at all. And when people cannot define you, they cannot predict you. When they cannot predict you, they cannot mentally control their understanding of you. And when they cannot control their understanding, they give more attention, more respect, more space, not because they are told to, but because uncertainty naturally creates distance and focus. Someone in the room shifted slightly in their seat. Another person inhaled slowly and released it, not in discomfort, but in adjustment, because their expectations had quietly dissolved. The interaction had not followed the normal path. It had gone somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar. And unfamiliar moments stay longer in memory, not because they are loud, but because they are unresolved. He remained calm. He didn't look around to check their reactions. He didn't seek approval. He didn't seek agreement. He didn't seek validation. He didn't need confirmation. He was complete without their understanding. This created a quiet form of independence, not visible, but deeply felt, because most people rely on others to stabilize their identity. Most people feel pressure to explain themselves, to justify themselves, to make others comfortable. But he didn't carry that pressure. He didn't carry that need. He existed without adjusting himself to reduce uncertainty, and that made his presence feel different. Not louder, not stronger, just less dependent. The conversation slowly continued after that. Other questions appeared. Other words were spoken. But something subtle had changed permanently. They were no longer interacting with him as a category. They were interacting with him as something they could not simplify, something they had to observe directly, without shortcuts, without assumptions, without control. He hadn't forced that change. He hadn't demanded it. He hadn't announced it. It happened naturally, quietly, simply because he refused to become something fixed for their comfort. He didn't explain his style. He declined the label. And after that, the room no longer saw him the same way.